Hello my dear friends, you're on the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 19th of June of 2023. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. The most important and the most interesting updates are coming from the Battle of Orekhov and the Battle of Petykhatki. We discussed Petykhatki many times in the previous videos, and as you know, the Ukrainians during the previous days launched a lot of offensive operations, lots of attempts to capture this settlement, and the main forces that took place in that operation was, I'll remind you one more time, the forces of 128th Mountain Assault Brigade, the forces of 65th Mechanized Brigade, and of course the forces of 130th Reconnaissance Battalion. And as a result of those attacks, the Ukrainians managed to capture that settlement, and furthermore, official Telegram channel of head of Ukrainian army Zaluzhny published a video, small shortcuts of the events that took place in that settlement. And yesterday, the Ukrainian forces of 128th Mountain Assault Brigade published a video where they were saying that as a result of fierce fightings they managed to capture Petykhatki. And this video was published today on the 19th of June, but if you have some know how to check the metadata video file, you would know that that video was made on the 18th of June. So basically the Ukrainians captured Petykhatki yesterday, and we discussed the situation, but after the Ukrainians entered that settlement, they penetrated the western defense orders of the Russians, entered the central and the eastern part, and as a result of those attacks, the Russians from the central part and the eastern part were forced to step back to the south. Yesterday we saw a lot of videos how the Russians were sending their reserves and their reinforcements along the road from Zherebyanki to Petykhatki. We saw the video how the Russians were attacking the Ukrainian positions from this road in direction of the western side of Petykhatki. We saw also from the Ukrainian side the video how the Ukrainians were attacking the Russians along this road, and that few Russian armored vehicles were destroyed. But today, during the day, we got another video, the final, I believe the last video from the Russian side, when they were saying and showing us how they started the liberation operation over Petykhatki and probably the counter-offensive operation. And as a result of that operation, the Ukrainians were forced to step back, and basically, according to the last update we have, by the 5 p.m. of the local time, the Russians managed to return control over the settlement and to establish their Russian flag above this territory. Of course, for now, we're not going to change the color of this settlement because the Ukrainians, of course, were forced to step back to the north, and the Ukrainians were forced to step back to the to cross the river and to establish positions, at least those forces who could do this in the northern area of the settlement. But the most important thing, how the operation took place. Basically the Russians did a very interesting trick. First of all, the Russians, as soon as they lost control over the settlement, and the first thing they did is start bombing and shelling the Ukrainians' positions and a small, let's say, neck of the battle in the vicinity of this forest. So basically the Russians attack using all types of weapons they have in direction of this territory. And let's color this territory in red color. So basically the Russians destroyed the Ukrainians' possibilities to send their forces and reserves using this area, and they destroyed the Ukrainian positions in this and the edge of this forest. After that, probably the Russians did have some maps and they knew some safe roads that goes from Zherebyanki to the western part of Petykhatki, and basically based on that video the Russians managed to cross the forest and to establish their forces on the western part of Petykhatki, when the most of the Ukrainian forces have already been redeployed in the central and in the eastern part of that settlement. So basically what did the Russians do? They managed to block the Ukrainian forces from the western side. As soon as they did this, the Russians sent another, they launched a massive counter-offensive operation with those Russian forces who left the central and the eastern part. They attacked the Ukrainians from the south. They entered the eastern part of Petykhatki, and basically they cut the Ukrainians' supply roads that goes from Petykhatki to the north in direction of Lapkova and Stepova. So basically what did the Russians do? They allowed the Ukrainians to enter this settlement. This settlement is located in the lowland. After that, the Russians destroyed the and established fire control with flamethrower systems and different types of artillery systems. They established physical and fire control over the supply roads that Ukrainians were using. After that, they sent reserves to the west and to the east and to the central part, and they encircled the Ukrainian forces, the rest of 128th Brigade inside of Petykhatki, and they burned those forces inside of that settlement. So that was basically the operation that the Russians managed to implement during the previous 24 hours. I'm not sure that the Russians still control the settlement. Maybe they have left this settlement before night, or they will try to establish fortifications and they will try to repel Ukrainian attacks. Who knows? The next day will give us answers to these questions. Now we're moving further to Orekhov bridgehead. There were a lot of updates on this territory as well. The Russians reported that as a result of air defense system, they managed to shut down helicopter Mi-8 in the vicinity of Orekhov. Furthermore, the Russians reported that during the previous 24 hours, they managed to repel the Ukrainian attacks in direction of Novopokrovka, Novofedorovka, and Verbova, in direction of all these three settlements. Furthermore, the Russians published a very interesting video how they attacked and destroyed Leopard tank somewhere on the fields of Orekhov bridgehead. And furthermore, the Russians published another video how the helicopters Kf-52 were attacking and destroying the Ukrainian armored vehicles. This is another new fresh video showing the results of usage of Russian helicopters. But the most important thing is that after a few days of failed Ukrainian attempts to establish control over Robotyne, or at least to develop their bridgehead in direction of this settlement, the Russians launched their own counteroffensive operation, and the Russian blogger military expert Rybar reported that as a result of that counter-offensive operation, the Russians managed to regain all their lost positions during the first phase of Ukrainian counter-offensive operation. So basically, Rybar reported that as a result of counter-offensive operation, Russian counter-offensive operation, they managed to return control over this small cloud, over this small salient. I'm not saying that the Russians are going to keep this territory. As we discussed, the military summary channel is not going to update map in the vicinity of Orekhov until we got the real evidence of control or footage of control this or that bridgehead. For now, it's just like a fact that was provided by the Russian sources that as a result of counteroffensive, they managed to push the Ukrainians as far as possible in direction of Malo-Takmachka and Novodanilovka. One more time, probably the Russians will be forced to leave this bridgehead before night comes. They will mine this territory and they will leave this territory back to the south, because I don't think that they're able to hold this territory and to counter attack and to defeat another Ukrainian rush to the south. Now we're moving further to the Vremivka tactical bridgehead. There were a lot of updates during the previous 24 hours as well. The Russians reported that Ukrainians made another attempt to attack Rovnopol. That attack was repelled. The Ukrainians made a lot of attempts to attack the Russians in direction of Urozhaina to the south, bypass Urozhaina in direction of Staromlynovka. Those attacks were repelled according to the Ministry of Defense. And there was another attack in direction of Novodonetsk. The attack in direction of Novodonetsk we discussed in the previous videos. The Russians published how they launched counter-offensive operation from Novomayorsk, and as a result of those attacks, the Ukrainians lost, according to the Russian source, at least 50 pieces of military vehicles, of different types of armored vehicles, including French IMX-10. So as you can see, that was a very big defeat of the Ukrainian forces. But from the other side, another interesting thing that the Russians published another video how another Ukrainian armored vehicles was destroyed on the minefields. But from the other side, the other Russian sources published, like Rybar, that by the 10 a.m. of the local time of the 19th of June, the Ukrainians, as a result of those attacks, that offensive operation, managed to penetrate the Russians' defense orders between Urozhaina and Novodonetsk and capture some fields in the direction of Staromlynovka and Kremenchik. So basically, according to Rybar, the Ukrainians during the previous 24 hours managed to capture these fields between like Урожайная between Старомлыновka, Кременчук, Novodonetsk. So according to Rybar, I think that we need to wait a little bit more, because if this piece of information is correct, most of the mappers and bloggers will update their resources and their maps. But for now, this is just the only military expert who reported that the Ukrainians managed to capture these fields between these small settlements like Novodonetsk, Kremenchuk, Staromlynovka, and Urozhaynaya. The Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation reported that the entire Ukrainian losses between Petykhatki, Orekhov bridgehead, and Vremivka tactical bridgehead were around 100 soldiers, 31 armored vehicles, including 3 tanks, and around 5 artillery systems. So as you can see, the losses when talking about manpower is not so heavy, but as I understand, the Russians haven't included the Ukrainian losses from Petykhatki. They will give us this information a little bit later, as soon as they will be able to solve and to fix the issues on this bridgehead, because currently, as I understand, there are still a lot of problems, and the battle of Petykhatki hasn't ended. We're going to see more attempts from the Ukrainian side to capture this settlement. And when talking about armored vehicles, of course, the losses of the Ukrainians from the Ukrainian side are very heavy. Now we're moving further to Ugledar bridgehead, and today the Russians published how they're bombing and shelling the settlement, the residential area by the name of Nikolsky Dachi between Pavlovka and Nikolska. They were bombing and shelling the Ukrainians, and if you remember, during the previous months, the Russians managed to capture this part. But if you remember, after the Ukrainians launched counteroffensive operation on Vremivka tactical bridgehead, the Ukrainians launched another support operation in direction of Nikolsky residential area, and basically as a result of that attack, the Ukrainians managed to establish control over this part and basically to cut Pavlovka from Nikolska with this small like square between these two settlements. We haven't discussed that result, but today the Russians published the video. So basically that was the result of that offensive operation from that support operation from the Ukrainian side. Very interesting updates are coming from Marinka bridgehead. Today in the previous video we discussed new tactics that the Russians started using. They start using the Shahed mobiles, Shahed tanks, completely fully loaded with lots of explosion. And on this video you can see how the Russians were trying to send their tank as close as possible to Ukrainian positions. This area is geolocated, and at some minute that tank was destroyed, and there was a very significant explosion. Later the Russian sources provided us piece of information that as a result of storming operation, these fortifications have fell, and the Russians captured this territory, this bridgehead, and the main forces who took part in that operation was Storm Z squads that, according to some unofficial sources, are under control of the Minister of Defense of Russian Federation, Shoigu. And one more time, Rybar reported that he was the source who confirmed the piece of information that the Russians managed to advance and to capture this bridgehead. And this is a very important victory from the Russian side, because basically by taking control over this settlement, over these fortifications, and I'll remind you that these two fortifications were the most powerful fortifications between Pobeda and Novy Mikhailovka, and those were the barriers that the Russians couldn't bypass to attack Novy Mikhailovka from the north. Currently these fortifications are under Russian control, and basically the Russians currently have possibilities or got access to this operational square, and basically within the next days the Russians will be able to start offensive operation in direction of this white cloud. They will focus on these territories. They will try to capture them, of course, obviously, and this can give the Russians significant result and significant benefits in the future. And the thing is that from when talking about the southern area of these fortifications, the Russians during the next weeks, I believe, will try to get control over this forest line, over these fortifications. And if the Russians are able to do this, after that they will be able to establish physical and fire control over the supply roads that goes from Konstantinovka to Novy Mikhailovka, and basically Novy Mikhailovka will appear in operational encirclement. And this is a very tough nut for the Russians. They were trying to crack this nut since the beginning of the special military operation, and finally on the 19th of June, after a year, they managed to got the outskirts of this settlement and to establish fire control over the supply roads over the settlements. If we try to calculate the distance between the possible Russian positions and where over the supply roads, we see that the distance is around 2.30 kilometers, so just the Russians can use just regular tanks to establish control over them. And from the southern bridgehead, the distance a little bit bigger, but anyway also like 3.61 kilometers. Anyway, the Russians have made a lot of things to complete the story of Novomikhailivka, which opens the Russians the gates to complete the story of Ugledar and Marinka as well. Furthermore, this bridgehead gives the Russians possibility to bypass Pobeda from the south and also to attack Marinka from the south, and also to complete the story of this bridgehead. Anyway, as you can see, the Russians got significant results, and that they will try to develop within the next months. When talking about Donetsk front line, the Russians report that they repelled attacks from the Ukrainian side in direction Stara Mikhailovka, Pervomaiska, and in the vicinity of Stepova. The Ukrainians continue making attempts to return control over the bridgehead on the northern part of Avdiivka. They understand the value of this bridgehead. They understand that anyway, at some day, this is going to be become the next story of Battle of Ukraine and Avdiivka bridgehead. Anyway, so the Ukrainians, meanwhile, the clashes in Orekhov, Marinka, tried to secure themselves and to return control over Krasnogorovka. The Russians reported that the Ukrainians lost during the previous 24 hours 340 soldiers, 7 armored vehicles, and 3 artillery systems on the vicinity of Donetsk front line. When talking about Artyomovsk, there are no changes. Just to update that the Russians destroyed the ammo depot of 5th Assault Brigade. That is the main forces of Ukrainians' offensive operation on the flanks of Bakhmut. Basically, the main forces who tried to attack and return control over the trenches in the vicinity of Klishevka. And these forces lost their ammo depot in the vicinity of Ivanovska. There were no more updates about the situation in Artyomovsk. Probably the Ukrainians took a decision to slow down a little bit and to get more reserves or something like this. Now we are moving to Kupiansk Liman front line. We're going to start first with Liman front line, and the situation is getting very interesting on this bridgehead. For example, today somewhere at noontime, the Russians reported that as a result of fierce offensive operation from the Ukrainian side, they managed to repel the attacks of 67th, 63rd and 42nd brigades of Ukrainian forces. We discussed that Ukrainians have redeployed from their strategical reserves the forces of 63rd Mechanized Brigade in the vicinity of Toretsk. According to that report, the Russians repelled attack of 67th Mechanized Brigade. This brigade was located in the vicinity of Artyomovsk, and the most important update is that the Russians repelled attack of 42nd Brigade, and 42nd Brigade is Brigade of Strategical Reserves, and you can find this brigade on deployment map in the vicinity of Kremenchuk. And this is the most interesting piece of news about this bridgehead. So basically, the Russians confirmed that Ukrainians were forced to move their strategical reserves not to Orekhov, not to Kherson, not to Vremivka tactical bridgehead. They were forced to move their 42nd Mechanized Brigade in the vicinity of Liman and Kremenaya. Furthermore, today the Minister of Defense of Ukraine reported that the Russians launched their own offensive, very heavy offensive operation, and the main forces that took part and take part in this offensive operation is the forces of 72nd Air Assault Division. And basically, according to the Ukrainians report, the Russians are trying to complete the story of the bridgehead between this Zherebets River and so basically the Russians want to complete the story of Kremenaya bridgehead, and basically this might be the beginning of the third battle of Liman. Very interesting updates. Furthermore, the Minister of Defense of Russian Federation reported that the total losses of Ukrainians on Liman front line were around 105 soldiers. And the level of losses is higher in comparison with the previous months. The last time we saw such a big level of losses was when the Russians launched support operation in Liman during the storming process of Bakhmut. So the last time we saw such a big losses were somewhere like the end of March and the beginning of April. As we can see, the Russians made a small operational pause during this month. Probably they managed to regroup, and also the Russians see that Ukrainians lost a lot of armored vehicles on Orekhov and Vremivka tactical bridgeheads. Basically, the Ukrainians lost, when talking about armored vehicles, they lost armored vehicles for around 3 or 4 brigades already. So basically, the Russians, based on their just simple mathematics, understand that Ukrainians don't have reserves in when talking about vehicles and tanks. They have manpower, but what can you do with manpower when against the Russian tanks like T-90 and armored vehicles and so on? So it's a very logical step from the Russian side, and they will try to advance and develop this bridgehead. Furthermore, when talking about Kupiansk front line, the Russians reported that Ukrainians lost 45 soldiers, and we understand that the situation on this bridgehead is almost the same in comparison with the previous days. We see just the activation of the Russians on Liman front line, and we will follow the situation, and we expect more updates from this territory. Now let's move a little bit to the south, and we will complete the part on the ground with Kherson and with Zaporozhye power plant. The Russians published the video how the situation in the vicinity of nuclear power plant has changed. As you can see, the situation is critical. The water have almost left this territory, and we talked a lot about the Ukrainians' attempts to attack currently the Zaporozhye power plant because of the absence of river and water on this bridgehead. But I'll give you my opinion. Even if the Ukrainians currently are not able to do this because there is still a lot of water and the ground is not the quality of ground is very poor for such type of operation. But anyway, I'm telling you that if the Ukrainians are not going to use the benefits of this situation now to attack Zaporozhye power plant, believe me, the Russians will use these benefits during the winter of 2023, when the ground will be freezed, if the winter is going to be cold. And if the winter is going to be cold, and if the ground will be freezed very deep inside of this territory, believe me, the Russians will cross this area using tanks, armored vehicles, and they will just capture Zaporozhye, or at least encircle this territory easily. So either or the Ukrainians will use the benefits now, or the Russians will use them during the winter of 2023. Another very interesting information are coming from Kherson. The Russians reported that Ukrainians accumulated significant number of their forces in this area, and some sources are saying that probably the Ukrainians are planning to start crossing Dnipro operation to attack the Russians' position. The water has left this territory, and the Ukrainians have a small window to capture the Russian fortifications before the Russians return back to these positions. And a very interesting video have arrived today from Odessa. This video is not about clashes, this is the video about the party and dancing in Odessa. I'm showing you this video because I don't understand the situation. It's Ukraine, it's some party in Odessa, and meanwhile the soldiers of 128th, 37th, 31st, 23rd brigades are dying for Ukrainians. We see how people have party in this settlement. I don't understand that, and yeah, I also condemn this situation. It's nonsense, if you ask my opinion. And I don't have any words how to explain the situation in Ukraine when one part of Ukraine is fighting for their independence, let's call it like this, and another part is dancing and having a very fun time on the rest part of Ukraine. Very interesting updates are coming from the north of Ukraine, from Kiev region. Today the Russian intelligence reported that the Ukrainians continue working on the creation of dirty nuclear bomb. They have redeployed the nuclear wastes from the western nuclear power plants in the vicinity of Chernobyl, and they continue working on creation of that dirty bomb. So we'll see what the Russians are going to do with this. And the final update is coming not from Ukraine, but from the United States of America, to be more precise, from China. As you know, the Antony Blinken, the 71st United States Secretary of State, today with official visit arrived to China, and he had a meeting with the comrade Xi Jinping, with the leader of China. They had conversation, they talk a lot, and after that conversation, for example, the Antony Blinken reported that the United States does not support the independence of Taiwan, and does not intend to enter into conflict with China. Washington does not seek a new Cold War and does not want to change the Chinese system. That was the words of the most powerful person in the United States of America. From the other side, Xi Jinping reported that the future and destiny of mankind depends on whether China and the United States can properly coexist. China respects U.S. interests and will not challenge Washington. The United States must respect China and not harm its legitimate rights and interests. So as you can see, it's a very, very big warning for the Russians. Of course, basically and probably most of meetings of such type ends with such talks and such notes and so on. But anyway, I don't think that people in Moscow are very happy with this visit and those words that were spoken after that meeting. So we'll see what is going to be next, because as I understand, one thing these people told us and another thing happened in reality. But anyway, the consequences of that meeting we're going to see within the next few days or weeks or months, who knows. So, and we will see. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds to condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for your watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.